Welcome back. I have a collection of unsettling stories centered around stigmatized properties, places with dark histories that linger in the air long after tragedy strikes. In Japan, these properties are called jiko bukken, a term used for homes where an unnatural death has occurred. In Japanese, the characters jiko, accident, and bukken, property, describe places that have seen suicides, murders, fires, or neglect, leaving behind more than just empty rooms. Such properties can be acquired at shockingly low prices, sometimes for less than a quarter of their market value. However, the reasons for the discount are as eerie as they come. While some are drawn in by the idea of making a saving, others find themselves haunted by the shadows of the past, from whispers of uninvited guests to unexplained events. Living in a home with a history can be a gamble far more daunting than its financial cost. In these stories, you'll explore the strange and often terrifying experiences of those who have lived or worked in these stigmatized properties. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, be careful for what you wish for. Sometimes a cheap home might come with a much steeper price. Now let's dive into these true stories of disturbing homes with histories, where the past never truly stays behind. Here's the bells. I live in a small city in Yamagata Prefecture, famous for its Yonezawa beef. And this story took place when I was in primary school, a long time ago. Although I didn't experience any actual ghostly phenomena, this was the scariest moment I've ever had in any haunted spot that I've visited. Stick around if you have time. There's a local spot we all know of called the Haunted Mansion. I only recently learned that it was originally a block of flats where workers from a nearby industrial park used to live. Yonezawa is considered an industrial town, at least by Tohoku standards. I found that out recently too. I guess you could say I've done some digging into my past lately. It was during the summer holidays. Back in those days, airsoft guns were all the rage. At first we were content shooting at cans or plastic action figures, but after watching an American film called Class of 1999 with my mates, we became obsessed with what we called at the time, playing war. We couldn't resist, so we'd go out into the stifling heat on our bikes, shooting at each other by riverbanks or up in the mountains. Over time we wanted our games to feel more realistic. So we set some rules, we formed teams and planned our strategies. We even got hold of some goggles and some helmets for protection. Then one day one of my friends suggested that we play at the Haunted Mansion. I don't know if it went by any other name, so I'm just calling it what me and my friends called it. Now the Haunted Mansion was surrounded by rumors. No one really wanted to go near it, but it was the perfect spot for our war games. No houses nearby, no people to bother us, and lots of hiding places. We decided to do it at night to avoid the heat and any chance of getting caught. We gathered our usual crew, and most of the lads agreed to come. I packed a cheap bag of orange BB pellets, 2 airsoft guns, and a gas-powered Beretta 93R, and maybe one more gun. I can't quite remember now. I stuffed some snacks into my backpack too, and I headed out. That night, with my heart racing, I slipped out of the house through the lounge window, trying to be as silent as possible as not to wake my parents. I hopped onto my bike and headed out to our meeting spot. I arrived at the park where we all agreed to meet. 2 friends, A and B, were already there, hanging around near the toilets. 6 of us were supposed to show up, so we waited patiently. C arrived, but after about 20 minutes had passed, we figured D and E weren't going to make it, so the four of us set off for the haunted mansion. We rode up the dirt path in a silence of awe. Then, we hid our bikes in the bushes and crept onto the property. In the dead of night, it was beyond eerie, let me tell you. The entrance to the mansion was sealed off, but many of the windows were broken, so that meant that we could easily get inside through one of them. Before going in, we took a moment to discuss the rules for the game of war we were about to play. And we made a few backup plans, just in case things went south and didn't go as we expected. I was paired with A, while B and C teamed up to form the other side. The mansion itself was massive, standing 6 stories tall. Its layout was similar to that of a school. Hi, Jay here. In Japan, for some reason they call blocks of apartments or flats mansions. Not like a haunted mansion that we might think of in Western culture. Just thought I'd chuck that out there. Back to the story. At the front, where you would expect to find the entrance, the doors were blocked off, but you could see the building stretched out symmetrically. On the other side of the building were 2 sets of staircases, one on the left and one on the right, which led to the upper floors. The mansion's design consisted of large open rooms or corridors between the staircases, making it easy to imagine how we'd navigate the different floors as we played. Each floor had spaces aligned like classrooms or rooms along the hallways. Something like that. It was the first time any of us had entered the building. I expected to get in through the ground floor window, but we climbed up to the balcony and slipped in through one of the shattered windows. The moment we entered, we were hit by a terrible smell. The place was in an absolute ruin, and it had this strange atmosphere to it, like it was something from a bygone era. Old bedding still lay on the floor, left untouched for years, covered in a thick layer of dust. It was as if the residents had vanished in the blink of an eye. The thing that scared me the most was finding a calendar from 1976. For some reason, that detail really stuck with me. We left the room, and we stepped into the hallway. It was pitch black, with no moonlight reaching inside. Our war game was quickly forgotten. Nobody really wanted to split up at that point. We tested the doors to see which rooms were unlocked. Most weren't, but a lot of the rooms didn't even have doors. It was like they had all been kicked in or kicked off. The walls were covered in graffiti, crude drawings and gang slogans scrawled across them, while the floors were littered with rubbish. Despite feeling a little more than apprehensive, we decided to explore one of the rooms. The entrance still had shoes lined up facing outwards, as if someone had only just stepped in and didn't come out. One of the flats we gained access to was small, but eerie. They had a kitchen at the front, leading to a 2 tatami room at the back. One of about 6 mats large, the other 4. Not a very big room is what I'm trying to say. The smaller room was bare, except for an old television and a table and a tiny fridge. The other room was relatively clean, but completely empty. We decided to rest for a bit, and we ended up chatting. Naturally, the conversation turned to the stories that surrounded the haunted mansion. Before it became a supposed haunted spot, the mansion had been employee housing for a nearby factory. Many families had lived there, but misfortune seemed to follow them. Legend goes that a child fell from the roof to their death, leading the parents to hang themselves in the woods through grief behind the building. Also, after the factory went bankrupt, there were 2 separate incidences of families committing suicide inside the mansion. Some said it was all connected to an ancient well that had been forcibly filled in before the mansion was built. In Yonezawa, there's a strange ritual performed when wells or ponds are buried and filled in to avoid bad luck. Maybe they hadn't done it properly. A suggested something reckless. Let's go check out the room on the 4th floor, where the family burned themselves to death. That was the story about the haunted mansion that creeped me out the most. There was a rumor about the room on the 4th floor, where a family had died in a fire, committing suicide by setting themselves alight. We were all terrified, but we agreed. We had to know if the rumors were true. We had come this far, right? One of my friends thought of them as nothing but legends. But let me tell you, when he was actually there, with us, I could sense his fear. It was palpable. And I could tell he was terrified as we headed up there. We left the room. We began to climb the grimy stairs, moving slowly, step by step. First the 2nd floor, then the 3rd, and then finally the 4th floor. As we ascended, the wind was whistling through the broken windows. It sounded like a distant, agonizing moan. We shone our lights ahead and kept walking, hearts pounding in unison, no doubt. Then the 4 of us all stopped in the middle of the hallway. The room at the end of the hall didn't have a door. Most of the rooms we had passed were missing doors, but this one felt different, more sinister. We shone our torches into the doorway at once. The entire room was scorched black, burnt beyond recognition. We stood there frozen, paralyzed with fear. We wanted to run, and eventually we did, but at first, our bodies wouldn't move. It was as if the very air itself had us trapped, holding us in place. The rumor about the 4th floor was true. This all happened when I was living in a dingy old flat in Nakameguro during my first year as a working adult. Back then I was determined to save money. I wasn't making much in my entry-level job, so I had to pick a flat that was within my limited budget. I found a cheap, worn-down place that had clearly seen better days. It was a 1DK, a single room with a tiny dining room kitchen in a 20-year-old building. The bathroom was practically a cubbyhole, a cramped unit bath with barely enough room to turn around in. The walls were so paper thin that you could hear everything the neighbors were doing. I'm talking about every little sound. If the guy next door sneezed, I'd hear it. When their phone vibrated, it felt like the walls themselves were trembling. I didn't mind too much. After all, I was out most of the day working. I'd come back only to eat, shower, and catch up on sleep. At the time, the state of the place and the sounds from next door were nothing more to me than a minor inconvenience. Then it started. I remember the first time it happened. I came home one evening after a long day at work. I dropped my laptop bag by the door and was just about to head into the room when I felt it. An odd tingling sensation, as if I'd walked straight into a spider's web. You know that feeling, don't you? That sticky, clinging sensation that catches on your skin, lingering on your face and arms. The spider's web. I brushed my hands across my face, and there was nothing there. I thought little of it at first. A place like this was bound to have spiders, and worse. It wasn't unusual to find the odd cockroach scurrying around the floor, and if there were roaches, surely there would be spiders too, preying on them. So I brushed it off as a spiderweb I couldn't see, and carried on with my night. But then it happened again, and again. Every time I came home from work, I felt that strange sensation, like invisible threads clinging to my face. I would stop in my tracks, frantically swiping the air around me, convinced there must be a web. And I hated spiders. But I could never find anything. No web, no spider, nothing. After a while, the sensation became more persistent, more deliberate. It wasn't just brushing against my skin anymore. It felt like something was deliberately touching me, caressing my skin, something unseen. I started feeling it almost every time I stepped through the door, and with that, the air inside my flat felt somehow different, heavier, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating. The once harmless feeling of walking into a web had become something sinister, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Eventually, I had had enough. I tore through the flat, searching every corner, every crevice for a nest, for spiders, or anything that could explain what was happening. I left no stone unturned, checked every inch of the walls, the ceiling, even behind the fridge. But there were no webs, no spiders, just me alone with a gnawing sense that something was wrong. I did find a cockroach though, and I killed it on the spot. I considered the idea that it could be strands of my hair blown by the wind when I opened the door. My hair was long enough to brush my ears, so maybe I was just being paranoid. Feeling stray strands tickling my face. But no, that didn't really explain it. I checked the mirror, carefully examining for loose hairs, also my hair, after I had a bath or a shower to see if I was losing it. But I realized that the sensation wasn't from my own hair. It was different, and worse. It was getting stronger. The next evening, as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it again. But this time, it wasn't just a brief touch. It was like something invisible was wrapping around my face, sliding down my cheek, as if trying to get my attention. A deep sense of dread settled over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was watching me. Waiting. Weeks passed with the same eerie occurrences. Then one day, in a desperate attempt to take my mind off of the flat's suffocating atmosphere, I invited two of my colleagues, let's just call them A and B, over for drinks. The mood at work had been tense, and a few beers and some casual conversation seemed like a good way to unwind. As we chatted about our living situations, I made the mistake of mentioning my flat's dilapidated state. "You wouldn't believe how run down my place is," I said, half joking, not realizing what those words would set in motion. To my surprise, A and B seemed intrigued, to say the least. They were saying things like, "We gotta see this place," and they insisted. And before I knew it, we were stopping by a convenience store to pick up some drinks and snacks, and then heading back to my flat. When we arrived, I saw A's eyes widen with surprise. "It's even worse than I expected," he said, laughing, clearly amused by the sorry state of the building. That kind of annoyed me, so I gave him a playful shove and said, "Shut up." I unlocked the door and I invited them inside. But as I held the door open, I noticed B standing there, frozen, his eyes locked on the entrance to my flat. He wasn't just staring though. He was completely spaced out, as if something had shocked him. So I say, "B, you coming in or what?" And he barely responds. Yeah?" His voice hollow. He walked in slowly, like he was stepping into something unpleasant. I thought he might have been drunk already, but we hadn't even started drinking yet. "Are you alright?" I said, giving him a concerned look. His eyes darted around the room nervously before he forced a weak smile and said, "Yeah, I'm fine." But there was something off about him. His movements were stiff, awkward, like he was trying to keep his balance, like something was bothering him. We sat down and drank, though the mood was strange from the start. A and I cracked jokes, and we talked about work, but B remained quiet. barely saying a word. He kept glancing around the room, as if expecting something to leap out at him. I tried to ignore it, but the uneasy atmosphere was starting to get to me. Eventually, it was time for them to leave. We called a taxi, and while waiting for it to arrive, we stood outside to get some fresh air. B had been acting strange the whole night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I walked them downstairs and waited with them for their taxi, and then, out of nowhere, B asked, "Is your flat an accident property?" "What?" I blinked, confused. "No, I don't think so. Of course not." B's face was pale. "There's a woman there. She hanged herself." A and I stared at him, completely stunned. A let out a nervous laugh, almost choking on his cigarette. "You can see that sort of thing?" he asked, incredulous. B nodded slowly, his eyes dark. "I don't always see them, but when I walked into your flat, I saw her. She's been hanging there the whole time." I felt my blood run cold. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" I demanded, my voice shaking. I was angry. Or was he just making it up? Or was he onto something? "I couldn't," he said in response, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was staring right at me. If I said anything, I was afraid I'd be cursed. She seemed so hate-filled." "Where the hell did you see her? I need to know," I blurted out. "She was hanging just off of the ground by the front door. I guess that's where she ended things," he muttered. The moment he said that, everything clicked. The sensation of the spider webs, the constant feeling of something brushing against my face. I realized it wasn't a web. It was her hair. I had been walking through her hair every time I entered my flat. There was this coat hook on the back of the first internal door as you step into the flat. It was practically hanging out of the wall. It was an old brass, really strong one. I now know why it was almost out of the wall. The realization hit me like a wave of ice, and I felt the blood drain from my face. My legs went weak beneath me. "Why the hell would you tell me this now?" I shouted. I felt the panic rising in my chest. "You're leaving and I'm going to be stuck there alone." But before they could respond, the taxi pulled up. A gave a sympathetic smile. "Good luck with that," he said, as if it were some joke. And while B raised his hand in apology, they both climbed into the cab and drove off, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the essentials and I fled to a nearby all-night manga cafe. I spent the night there. From that moment on, I knew I couldn't bring myself to sleep in that flat again. I started searching for a new place immediately, bouncing between A and B's flats and different cafes until I found somewhere else to live. When moving day finally came, A and B helped me pack up and leave that cursed apartment behind. I didn't care how cheap it had been. I would never step foot into that place again. Years have gone by, but I was reminded of my experience a few months ago. I had some business back in Nakameguro, so out of curiosity, I wandered past the old flat, wondering if anyone had moved in. The building still stood, still as decrepit as ever, but I noticed an umbrella propped outside the door of the apartment I used to live in. Someone was living there now. I wonder if they've felt it yet, the spider's web, or if they've seen her. But none of that's my concern anymore, is it? This is a story that happened to a friend of mine during my first year of full-time work. He had been paying off his student loans on a modest salary, but despite that, he had a very active social life. It seemed like every other night he was out at some drinking party. With all that going on, it was no surprise that he was barely scraping by each month. What puzzled me, though, was that he lived in a surprisingly nice flat. One day I asked him, "If you're that hard up for money, why don't you just cut back on rent? I could help you move. We could try and keep costs down as much as possible." But he waved me off with a casual, "Nah, mate. You won't find anywhere cheaper than this. It's impossible." I was stunned. How could this apartment, which should have easily been going for over 100,000 yen a month, be that cheap? It just didn't add up. So I pressed him, curious about how he'd found such a bargain. His answer, when it came, left me speechless. "Oh, didn't I mention? It's a Jiko Buken. You know, a home with a history." I stared at him, wondering if he was being serious. Seeing my expression, he shrugged and continued, "I drink a lot, and I've always been out a lot, especially since uni. And with money so tight, I figured I might as well go for somewhere cheap. I mean, I've got no sixth sense. Look at me. I don't see spirits or anything like that, apart from the ones I'm drinking, right? So, I didn't think it'd bother me." I couldn't quite close my mouth. I was shocked how nonchalantly he said it, but in the end, I thought maybe he was being somewhat smart. He didn't believe in that sort of thing, and it's not like he ever mentioned he had any trouble. So maybe it was a smart move on his part. But then summer rolled around. Work was starting to feel more manageable, and I hadn't seen my friend in a while. We decided to meet up in Shibuya for a catch-up. The moment I saw him, I nearly collapsed from shock. The guy who used to be stocky and full of life had withered away. His body was gaunt and skeletal. The first words from my mouth were, "What the fuck happened to you?" He looked at me, pale and exhausted, and confessed that he hadn't called me to hang out, but because he needed to talk. He said he needed some advice. His story spilled out, one dreadful detail after another. Strange things had been happening in his flat. His story spilled out, one dreadful detail after another. Strange things had been happening in his flat. And he hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks. Almost every night, he experienced sleep paralysis, waking up in the middle of the night, unable to move, his room gripped by an unnatural coldness. He'd hear these eerie creaking sounds like something was scraping across the floorboards or the walls. No matter how hard he tried, he could never rest properly. It was wearing him down to the point that he felt like he was falling apart. I suggested the obvious. "Do you reckon it's because of what happened in there? You know, your apartment being what it is?" And he sighed, rubbed his face a little, and he said, "I think you're right. Ever since Golden Week, things have been going downhill. I'm barely getting 1 or 2 hours of sleep at night, and I'm at my limit, and that's why I'm here. I want to ask for your help." We decided to head straight to his real estate agent's office, hoping to find a solution. Well, in my head, I was trying to get him out of the contract that he was probably locked into. When we explained the situation, the woman behind the desk gave a knowing look. Her shoulders slumped, as if she had been expecting this. She went on to explain that the flat became a stigmatized property about 5 years earlier. Someone had died in that flat during Golden Week, and ever since then, tenants had come and gone quickly, unable to stay for long. She told us that when my friend came in, so cheerful and carefree, she had hoped that he might be the one who could handle it the longest. He'd even brushed off the details by saying, "Oh, stigmatized property? Well, that explains why it's so cheap. Don't tell me any more. I just want something affordable. I'll take it. Her voice wavered as she admitted that she thought perhaps he couldn't even manage it. My friend moved out shortly after that, and I'm relieved to say he returned to his old, healthier self once he settled into a new place. As for the flat, the last time I checked, it was unoccupied. Even in a bustling apartment complex, that one room stays dark and empty. I tried to find it on the website, but apparently they've given up trying to rent it out anymore. These days, there's a growing number of people willing to live in a home with a history because of how cheap those properties can be. But after seeing what happened to my friend, I definitely wouldn't recommend it. In the end, what had seemed like the perfect solution, a cheap flat with no strings attached, became a haunting lesson. Maybe it was all in his head. Maybe it was the stress of life catching up on him. With all his drinking, working late hours and getting less and less sleep. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. Whatever it was, one thing's for sure. A low price can come with a heavy cost. Back in the day, I worked part-time at a karaoke place. It wasn't one of those places that had been done up after something else left. This was a brand new 2-story building that had just opened. It was right off of a major road, so work was busy all day. Not your standard location for a scary story, right? I'm guessing you're thinking haunted mansions and stuff like that. Well, I didn't think it was all that scary until about Obon season, when something went down that changed everything. The owner, a real piece of work, got into trouble. Apparently he knocked up some girl and things got messy, and she ended up taking her own life. But this owner, do you think he cared? No, he definitely didn't. I remember him sitting there with a cigarette in his mouth saying, "Not my problem, she went and offed herself." He was already a bit of a scumbag in my opinion, treating the staff like crap. But this made things so much worse. The female employees started quitting left, right and center. It was a shame because the pay was pretty decent. And as a broke student, I needed the money, so even though the whole thing really pissed me off, I decided to keep my head down and carry on working. With so many people quitting, I got stuck doing both the night shift and the morning shift. One day, I came in for my shift and found the owner collapsed on the floor of the office, foaming at the mouth. I was so freaked out that I nearly fell over, but I managed to call an ambulance. The police came too, suspecting foul play, and for a while I was under suspicion. They questioned me, thinking that I had something to do with it, which was just fantastic. It wasn't until they reviewed the CCTV footage that their whole attitude changed. After that, they stopped interrogating me, but they didn't tell me why or what they'd seen. Luckily, the manager came in to cover for the owner, and he let me in on it. Apparently, after the shop had closed and all the cleaning was done, the owner had gone for his usual check of the place. Then, out of nowhere, he screamed and bolted through the building, only to collapse in the office. And here's the freaky part. The exact moment he passed out, the CCTV stopped recording. The cameras just switched off, and there was no explanation for it. That's when things started really going downhill. After that day, strange things began happening. We'd hear a woman's voice crying through the speakers, even though there was no one in the rooms. The karaoke machines started breaking down for no reason. Something different every time. The worst, though, was when families started complaining about songs being added to their queue without anyone touching the system. I went in to check this out a few times, and right in front of my eyes, children's songs and anime tunes kept popping up on the screen one after another. It wasn't just a glitch, it happened nearly every time a family came in. By then it was getting too much for me. The whole place had a heavy, oppressive vibe, and I was starting to lose it. It was becoming mentally exhausting, so I told them I was too busy with finding a career in a field that I studied in to work anymore, and I quit. Even though it wasn't the right time for that kind of excuse, I just felt like I had to get out. Not even 6 months after I left, the place shut down. I've seen a few different new businesses come and go since then too. First, as we know, it was a karaoke spot, and then a game arcade, and then a yakiniku joint. A few other places moved into, but none of them lasted very long. That building got a reputation as a haunted house, and nobody wanted anything to do with it, or go near it. It stayed abandoned for a while, but earlier this year, they finally tore it down. I'm writing this because the memories came flooding back when I heard that it was gone. Sometimes there are places where nothing seems to work. You'd think it's because they're in a bad location, but this place was right by a busy road, in a perfect spot. At one point, the shop was pulling in 300,000 to 400,000 yen a day, but after the owner collapsed, everything tanked. By the time I left, I think it was making barely 40,000 yen a day. When you see cops and ambulances swarming around a place, people start to avoid it, even if they don't believe in ghosts. It's just a feeling that something is off. Oh, and after I quit, one of my uni seniors thought that it would be hilarious to go there late at night to try and communicate with any potential spirits in the karaoke rooms. Apparently while he was there, the breaker tripped and the whole place went dark. They ended up comping his bill and sending him and the other customers home for free. At the time, I didn't want to hear about it, but thinking back on it now, it kind of gives me a half smile. That building had a really bad vibe. I guess some places are just cursed. No matter what moves in, it never lasts. It makes you wonder if something's still hanging around, doesn't it?